The Basics of Economics by Tony Cleaver. The direct control and devaluation changes tend to correct money flow imbalances and thus restore equilibrium to the balance of payments, though not straight away. Both demand and supply may be price inelastic at first. Total currency flow thus takes the J-curve shape over time. The 1930s in particular were years when direct controls and competitive devaluations were attempted by some nations to maximize injections and minimize leakages at the expense of others. They were known as mercantilist or beggar my neighbor policies, and as a result only served to export recession and impoverish trade for all. If a country tries to protect its own industries from losing out to imports and subsidizes exports to try and steal overseas markets from others, then it cannot succeed in the long run. It commits the fallacy of composition. What seems a good policy for one country to practice cannot work if all do the same. As a general rule, the World Trade Organization argues that free trade is the best policy as it tries to promote the idea of all countries growing together. The argument that supports this claim is the principle of comparative advantage, which has been lauded as the most important, non-obvious principle of economics. The most common argument against free trade is that it creates unemployment in those domestic industries that cannot compete against cheap imports. While this is undoubtedly true, it's nonetheless argued that there are sufficient welfare gains to be made by unrestricted trade to compensate the losses and still leave a net gain for the country as a whole. The principle is as true for individuals as it is true for communities. By specializing in certain employments, you can earn more than if you try to produce everything yourself. Economists must wonder what exactly drives this particular successful economic animal known as the multinational enterprise. One reason is to bypass any host country restrictions on trade, like in the case when the European Community imposed tight quotas on car imports from Japan. Multinationals in this case invested in large-scale car plants in the host countries behind the trade walls the European Community had erected. One of the benefits of increasing globalization is the billions of dollars in investments that have flowed into developing countries which would otherwise not have occurred. In a case where a multinational corporation is set up to serve the local market, the welfare of the domestic consumers is increased. People only buy goods if the value of the product consumed is greater than the value of the money. One popular disadvantage against the multinationals setting up offices in host nations is that they act to siphon off profits back to their parent country. Over time, multinationals therefore act as a conduit for capital to move out of developing countries, not into them. While this argument may not be representative of all types of investments, it's particularly true in the case of oil exploration and mining. National governments are responsible for setting the rules for commerce within their borders, and multinationals can only do business within the terms of contract agreed. It is for the host nations, therefore, to monitor the balance of interests served. We live in an international marketplace nowadays. In fact, It has always been so. National sovereignty is a thing of the past, and the long distant past at that. The chance to make fortunes in trade has driven the expansion of empires from Roman times through the race to establish European colonies to the emphasis on globalization today. While economic fortunes are inextricably intertwined. There yet remain some corners of the world where the global reach of trade has not made significant inroads. Such places may retain prized traditional cultures, but they also support very low material standards of living. But given the choice, such a people would want the increasing incomes that access to world markets gives them. Growing mild nationalism in business is the best defense against economic imperialism. The more a multinational raises long-term capital stock holders in the host countries, and the more it employs managers in senior positions, that is, the more truly multinational it becomes. Then no country becomes foreign, and thus the more likely the ethos within the firm seek to promote equitable outcomes for all parties. Mainstream economists have come up with the following key steps to explain economic development worldwide: fiscal capital, human capital, policy reform, institutional reform, and social development. The economic history of the Soviet Union shows the importance of investment in fiscal capital. This nation grew to become a world power after the debacle of the First World War, due mainly to the Stalinist system of ruthless central planning that devoted increasing resources to building up capital goods in oil, iron and steel, transport and communication, machine, tools, defenses, etc. Neoclassical growth theory, however, emphasizes the free market, not central command, as the key allocating mechanism. Investment in fiscal capital only leads to economic growth and improvement in living standards in the short run. This is because the theory is subject to the law of diminishing returns. Only with the technological progress can long-run growth be possible. For countries such as the USA and other developed nations, it was not so much fiscal capital but increases in its quality, total factor productivity, that accounted for a significant fraction of their modern economic growth. If growth spawns advances in technology, and in turn such advances are not subject to the principle of diminishing returns, then the spread of technology will engender increased growth, and this will cause further technological change ad infinitum. What explains the chain reaction herein led to the endogenous growth theory by Paul Romer in the 1980s that emphasized the role of ideas and of human capital. Unlike most other economic goods, a profitable idea is non-rivalrous. My use of this idea does not deny yours. One person or 1,000 people can thus pursue a new technology with no diminution in the productivity of the idea. That is, ideas are not subject to diminishing returns. Profitable ideas do not come like manna from heaven. They are themselves the product of much education, training, and active experimentation, the accumulation of human capital. As Thomas Edison said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. According to Romer's growth theory, therefore, the productivity of ideas applied to industry technology will not lead to diminishing returns, but instead to constant returns to capital invested. Endogenous growth theory gives a role to government as well as to markets. Although much investment in research and development can be undertaken by private business concerns, it can only be based on the social capital that the public sector already provides, and it could not occur without it. Free markets fail to supply what we know as public goods and services, since there is no profit to be had in doing so. This includes primary and secondary education, transport and communication networks to facilitate mobility of resources. The state must provide the foundation upon which the market can build. Without the support of the state, therefore, technical progress will be limited and insufficient to generate growth. Policy reform is a critical function of any government. It can protect infant industry or promote inefficiency. It can promote competition or promote corruption, can stimulate a declining economy or stimulate inflation. Get the policies right and sustainable growth is possible. Get it wrong and wild swings in economic fortune result. All conditions necessary for economic growth, namely investments, capital goods, future outputs, technological progress, diminishing returns, concepts, price signals, market economics, pattern of resource allocation, etc., all taken together are still not sufficient to explain why some countries grow rich and others do not. There is a growing consensus, particularly from economic historians, that the missing factor, the key explanatory variable that links all the issues together, is the presence or absence of stable social, political, and economic institutions. Adam Smith, the professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University in 1776, was well aware of the ethical foundations of a market society. It was he who first emphasized that economic growth takes place with increasing specialization consequent upon the expansion of markets. It is argued that, without exception, countries grow slowest where property rights are weak or absent, the rule of law is unreliable, and where governments are corrupt. In such cases, the custom of trust and respect between citizens breaks down, the costs of transacting business soon becomes excessive, and no great growth in trade beyond personal contact is possible. Humankind's ingenuity is the only resource that is not in short supply and shows no sign of reaching exhaustion. Together, scientists and economists can come together and calculate costs and benefits of each and every practice that seems to threaten the environment and make their recommendations to the political class for action. The poor world cannot wait. Some countries are already growing fast, and others are desperate to follow in their footsteps. Populations in temperate lands who have dammed their rivers, consumed their native forests, and burned off their coal reserves in the course of industrialization may be rudely received if they protest about developing countries doing the same. If people in the developed world want others to ease up on their exploitation of the planet, they will have to pay them to do so. That is the market solution.